I've noticed there's been a shift in how games are made. It used to be about creating a fun gimmick, or telling a unique story, or even the creation of an entire universe for the players to explore. Now it just seems to be about marketing. Why tell an interesting story when you can just sell the idea of a hat for 25 bucks? I mean, sure, there's fun ones here and there, but very few recent games are truly magical. We've heard the story a million times by now. AAA games today aren't made for players. No, they're made for their investors. For example, what was the best game of 2022? You probably said either Elden Ring or God of War, unless you're a huge Dwarf Fortress fan, I guess. Don't get me wrong, I love those games as well. But people have become so used to garbage being released that they lose their minds over something that's merely above average. FromSoft aren't gods of development, and even they aren't immune to typical corporate BS. Anyone remember the people bitching about Dark Souls Remastered? The difference between FromSoft and most other large gaming companies is that they actually learned a lesson with that mistake. They learned not to nickel and dime the people allowing them to create. They went back to making their games the same way they always have since the 90s, and I highly respect them for that. But I have to wonder how this generation would act in a year like 1998, when there were a lot more devs around that did that. Look at this. Releases include Ocarina of Time, Metal Gear Solid, Crash 3, Banjo-Kazooie, and Half-Life, just to name a few. 1998 is like this golden year for games. It seems the dot-com bubble really fueled a lot of creative risk. To give a bit of context, there were many creative high points around that time, not just in games but everywhere. Music was evolving, love it or hate it, grunge had died and boy bands were slowly taking over, and the ubiquitous I'm Blue was just around the corner. Titanic had just come out in December of '97, one of the most successful movies ever to this day. I mean, even WWE was unstoppable at this point. What the hell was going on in the late 90s? It just seems like there was this tiny creative renaissance. It's easy to keep the nostalgia glasses on, though. Not every game that came out that year was good. I'd imagine most bad games from that year would have gotten overlooked just because of how many great games had already come out. So, was 1998 actually a golden year for gaming? Well, I'm going to look through the more obscure games of 1998 and see what I can find about a few of those lesser known titles. Starting with Robotron 64, released January 5th, 1998 for the Nintendo 64 by Crave Studios, marking the first game released in 1998. A remake of a popular 1987 top-down shooter arcade game named Robotron 2084, pretty influential game for its own time. The game designers of the Nintendo 64 version 11 years later, however, took a different approach to influence. A lot of games from this era look and play like tech demos. This is one of them. If you can get past the CIA experiment that is the title screen, it's a top-down shooter. Think Dead Ops Arcade or a really stripped down and unfun version of Geometry Wars. Every wave just adds more enemies, so the game is almost perpetually in slow motion. Upgrades are few and far between. You know how in Contra or in Ghouls and Ghosts, whenever you pick up an upgrade, it stays with you forever? Not this game. You pick up your triple shot and 5 seconds later, it's gone, not to return for the next 15 levels. The camera in this game is odd, but not annoying, if that makes sense. It's like the arena moves and not the actual camera. I think I'd still prefer a completely static angle for this type of game, though. And what can I really say about the music? It's something to get you pumped when you're stoned, I guess? I think this game for what it is. It's an experiment. A step into seizure-inducing low-poly 3D, using a known IP to boost recognition. Not everyone was as skilled as Nintendo with that back then. As revolutionary as the original arcade game was, this is pretty basic. But what's interesting about Robotron is that the original arcade game was developed by a guy named Eugene Jarvis. He had nothing to do with the Nintendo 64 version of the game, but had I not researched this game, I'd have never known about this guy, or how influential he was to video games. Let's rewind the clock a bit back to 1981. Jarvis, with a total team count of 4, creates a game called Defender while working for developer Williams Electronics. This game was able to stand out against arcade titles like Donkey Kong, Pac-Man, and Galaga, all released the same year. Defender ranks 7th in the best-selling arcade games of all time, making nearly $1 billion in revenue by 1993. I don't even want to think about that inflation adjustment. Jarvis went on to create more popular arcade titles like Blaster, Narc, and Smash TV. I mean, kids in the 80s must have been blown away with what kept coming out at the time. Have you ever played a game that made you want to create games? Whether or not you ever took on the challenge? Maybe not even that, but a game that just gave you this absolute sense of wonder. Jarvis's games did just that for a lot of people. This next game is hard to explain. A product of Japan, you know, the country that gave us Dark Souls, and some of the most brutal MMO bosses in history. They even gave the US a completely different Mario 2 because they thought the Americans would find the real one too difficult. Considering my main complaint about this game is its difficulty, they were probably right. Don't get me wrong, I enjoy a good Souls-like, but this is some bullshit. This is No One Can Stop Mr. Domino, also known as Do Not Stop Domino-kun in Japan. Classified as a puzzle game by Wikipedia, you play as Mr. Domino, an anthropomorphic domino. Well, actually, you get the choice of a few characters, that being the titular character, his female counterpart, Mrs. Domino, and for beating the game once, an unlockable character, Bruce. Why Bruce? I mean, if he was shaped like a shark, it at least kind of makes sense, but why is Bruce the devil?
The name Bruce does not have a specific meaning in the Japanese language. In Japanese, foreign names are often transcribed using katakana, a script used for foreign words. Bruce would typically be written as Barusu.
So no, it truly is a random choice. Maybe one of the devs knew a Barusu and thought it would be a cool name. I don't know, it's Japan, what do you want? There's also 2 other characters, Pierre Domino and this thing. Each character offers different stats, like speed and agility, but the controls are so jank it really doesn't matter. You're on a predetermined track and you can't stop, but you can slow down, speed up, and move side to side to change into different lanes. There are various obstacles to avoid along the way, and the placement of them is sometimes outright evil. Over a dreadfully short amount of time, Bruce here starts to turn gray. And when he becomes a certain shade of gray, the oh shit meter starts throwing 50 different signals at you to hurry up before the game ties you up and fucks you out of a continue. I feel like I'd be a best-selling author. My authoritarian credentials aside, this game is brutal, even with the infinite time cheat. The controls, or lack thereof, make this game pretty frustrating. Sometimes they work flawlessly, other times you tap once and the fucker moves 4 lanes over. Other times you can be holding a direction and this rectangular piece of shit doesn't move. This might be an emulator issue, but I wouldn't be so certain. Anyway, this game isn't exactly straightforward, and it is incredibly punishing. So for the majority of the footage being shown, an infinite time cheat is enabled. However, the reset blocks still work normally. The only other cheat being used here is the Bruce unlock. The goal of this game is to drop dominoes behind certain triggers, and then push the dominoes onto said triggers on the next lap. And the more triggers you can chain together, the higher your score. Once all triggers are pressed, the stage is complete. It's like a prototype version of an infinite runner, except you have an annoyingly short amount of time to complete some fairly complex maneuvers. So, pretty much the exact opposite of an infinite runner now that I think about it. There's also 2 different speed tiles that when run over will either speed you up or down. And 2 help blocks, I guess, that being the mandatory health block, skipping these is risky, and the dreaded pink reset block. Even with the time cheat, I have grown to fear the pink block. Nothing like setting up the final trigger only for you to hit the fucking speedy block, careening yourself right back to the very beginning of the stage. Maybe there's some type of score mechanic that I don't understand where these blocks are actually helpful, but I really don't see any reason for these blocks to exist other than to save you from eating a continue. The triggers themselves are pretty crazy. From a house of cards getting knocked over to a mother getting completely roasted by her turkey, this, ladies and gentlemen, this is art. Honestly, if this game wasn't so punishing in its difficulty, it probably would actually be fun. The game has 6 stages: Vegas, Japanese Kroger, Uncle Larry-san's house, park, amusement park, and Tower of Doom. Every stage is insane in its own way, but a few stand out. I mean, the family house stage probably has the craziest triggers because it's like a family getting terrorized by a magical domino. Kinda sounds like an Asylum movie waiting to happen. Tower of Doom, actually creatively titled No One Can Stop Mr. Domino, is definitely the most interesting stage of them all. It's the only stage in the game that has different tiers, and there's 4 triggers in each tier. It's essentially 3 mini stages combined into one bigger stage. Had there ever been a sequel, I'd imagine all of the stages in that game would probably follow this final stage's design. Overall, I think this game could have been a nice fun distraction if it weren't so punishing. The 80s and 90s certainly were an interesting time for games. No one really knew what worked at the time. Even big name companies were still open to experimenting with different types of games, so you'd end up with these really weird concepts that somehow worked. Think about all the indie devs you love today. That was almost every game company back then. I mean, sure, you had the shit companies like Atari and LJN, but you also had devs like Rare and Blizzard. Nowadays, you probably don't think too much about either of those companies, but back then, they couldn't be touched in their terms of quality. Well, seems 1998 wasn't a completely golden year for games. I did find some interesting things though. Hope you all enjoyed this video. Until next time.